You've done it. Well, perhaps these days I shouldn't make the assumption that you've done all of it, meaning that you've partaken of each and every video in the series, but hopefully you viewed at least the ones that are relevant to your current needs and uses for SharePoint. And hopefully you're comfortable with using several of the different features, if not all of them, in SharePoint. In this series, whether you've seen parts or the whole, I've done my best to provide a broad overview of how someone like yourself can use SharePoint. Although SharePoint is a tremendously complex platform comprised of a lot of different components, services, and supporting infrastructure, we've worked to keep it understandable and relevant. We talked about how SharePoint is focused on primarily 3 different types of services or tasks when it comes to information. That includes collaboration, content management, and information retrieval. All 3 of those work together in order to enhance security, consistency, and make our work more efficient. So no matter what type of business you're in, no matter what type of specific job role you have, these 3 components can result in these 3 outcomes when you use SharePoint. SharePoint sites are designed to provide communities where people can collaborate and share information more easily. Content, of course, is a critical component of that. In order to use content, people need to be able to find it. So SharePoint's integrated search capabilities that we just barely touched on as users is also a vital element to the platform, providing insights and allowing useful composites to be generated about people, content, and data rounds out the SharePoint wheel, as it's known. A lot of what makes SharePoint work so easily for us as users happens because of the behind-the-scenes work of the SharePoint network administrators that support it. That starts off with Microsoft Windows Server. That makes sure that we can get authenticated as users and provides user accounts through Active Directory. Most of us will also be using Microsoft Exchange Server. That, of course, manages our email and is what works through the Outlook client. And then, of course, there's some kind of Microsoft SharePoint 2013. That comes in 3 different flavors, if you will: Foundation, Standard, and Enterprise. Almost everything that we've talked about works with all 3 of these versions. Some of the features, like My Sites, for example, or a few of the advanced features, are not available with Foundation. But as you work, you'll become aware of what some of those are if you're using the Foundation service. As users, we don't have to know anything about this stuff. It all happens behind the scenes. But what it does for us is it provides a familiar platform on which we can begin to use SharePoint. All of the fascinating interaction and technology does become more relevant to us as users when we get to the structure of SharePoint itself, how it stores our information, and how it's organized. We need to keep in mind, even if we don't use it every day, that SharePoint is really a hierarchical structure, kind of like an org chart. And at the top is always a top-level site. Subsites are then used to organize and secure content below the main top-level site. Within any one of those, the top-level site or subsites, lists and libraries are used to actually store data and files. A site collection, if you ever hear that word, is a top-level site and all of the content that comes below it, whether that's 1 level or 100 levels. No matter how simple or complex the overall structure, because some companies may have just 1 or 2 top-level sites and others may have thousands, it's important to remember each site can only contain subsites, lists, and libraries, and your data is always going to be in lists and libraries. Lists and libraries are the primary containers for information in SharePoint, although there are other features like wikis and blogs that provide it in an unstructured way as well. Libraries are just specialized types of lists, and it's helpful to focus on their similarities before we focus on their differences. So lists and libraries both hold data. They're both composed of at least 1 column or field, but usually several columns or fields, and at least 1 view, 1 but only 1 default view, but again, there are probably multiple views associated with each list or library. Views determine how data displays on screen. They can be changed from the main screen or from the ribbon, and users can even create your own personal views. New items in lists and libraries are always created from the same main screen link or the ribbon. And all data entry, whether you're creating a new entry or editing an existing one, is done in Forms. You may be able to use the Quick Edit view, a brand new feature in 2013, to edit items directly on the main list screen. If you want to know when things are happening without having to go into all the lists and libraries, you can use RSS feeds or alerts to notify you of changes. And of course, you can always sort and filter items in a list, even if 100 other people are using them, to make it appear just the way you need it to for your current task. Of course, none of this works if you can't find it. so you can always search for content and people using the search box, which is usually in the upper right corner of the screen, but it might be somewhere else, so just look around for it. And it always makes us feel a little bit more comfortable that deleted items go to the recycle bin and they can be recovered if necessary. Libraries, unlike lists, are file-centric, and for many people, they are the main type of component that they work with in SharePoint. There are a few things that make libraries different that are important to understand. These include what are often known as document management features. We have no excuses for not using SharePoint because existing documents can be uploaded to a library either one at a time or in bulk. And new documents can be created from either within libraries or from within our familiar Office applications. Libraries can be connected to Office so that they are always available from the Office apps and Windows Explorer. Libraries can also be linked to Outlook, so you can put things like your calendar in Outlook if that's where you tend to spend most of your time and where it's very useful to see calendars together. Libraries can even be synced to your SkyDrive Pro account, and that makes them available offline and always synchronized. If these features are enabled, you also have the specific document management features. They include Checkout, which ensures that only one person can edit a document at a time, Versioning, which keeps a history of all changes to a document and allows you to revert to a prior version if necessary, and remembering that with versions you may also have minor or draft versions. Primarily, those limit who can see documents changed until they're published to the next major version. And lastly, Content Approval allows only the author or administrator to see new or edited documents until an admin approves them, at which time all users of the library can see them instantly. Of course, none of this matters for most of us in most organizations unless we can be assured that the information and data that we store in SharePoint is secure. Permissions are a critical part of SharePoint. As users, we don't worry about them so much directly, but we are affected by them. Typically, they're going to be managed by administrators. However, we do need to manage permissions in our own MySite, and it also helps to understand permissions as we work within SharePoint. So, we learned several things, including that SharePoint content needs to be secured, that SharePoint actually has 33 individual permissions that can be used, and those 33 individual permissions are combined into things called permission levels. Permission levels are applied to SharePoint groups. Individuals, like yourself, as well as network and Active Directory groups, can be added to SharePoint groups. Groups and their related permission levels are then applied to sites, lists, libraries, folders, and items. Administrators with permissions to modify permissions can modify permissions. I know that gets a little complicated, but just remember, if you're not an admin, you probably can't work with permissions. You'll need to ask for help to do that. As the owner of your MySite, though, you do manage permissions there, and that means you need to be careful about what you put in your MySite and how it's secured. By default, others have read-only access to your documents library in your MySite unless those documents are in Shared with Everyone. But again, you need to be aware, as the person who controls permissions in your MySite, of what permissions are applied and who has access to them. Speaking of your MySite, if your organization is using SharePoint Standard or Enterprise, and not Foundation, and if they decided to implement them, you have a MySite, which is your personal SharePoint site, intended for your own private information. You have a document library, a task list, and a blog. You can add other lists and libraries if you want. They are really just like another SharePoint site with some extra functionality. Your profile is part of your MySite and should be completed and kept up to date. You should also be sure to modify your newsfeed settings so that you can receive notifications that are important to you. Social networking features such as following, rating, liking, tagging, adding notes from the noteboard, and recommending are useful to you and assist your colleagues and organization to build a stronger information network as well. So your MySite isn't just a place to store things and have social chit-chat. It really becomes an important part of your business use of SharePoint. Sometimes when I talk about SharePoint, it seems overwhelming, but other times it seems so simple. And that's because it is both. The basic concepts are simple. It's a web-based way to work with data and familiar applications like Microsoft Office, but it can be designed and organized in literally an infinite number of ways and used in just as many ways. That's what I find so exciting about it. It is whatever we want and need it to be, and that's an exciting possibility. As a new user, it's important to keep track of the basics. Keep those in mind. No matter how big or daunting the overall structure may seem, No matter how many lists and libraries, wikis and blogs, documents and users are involved, each one on its own works exactly the same way. If you can begin to use it, get comfortable with it, it will allow you to create, store, and retrieve data more easily, which will make you more efficient and effective in your job. And isn't that what each and every one of us, no matter who we are or what kind of work we do, really wants to have? What you now know is exactly how to accomplish that. On behalf of myself, Aaron Olson, and Infinite Skills, I'd like to thank you for investing your time in learning more about the fabulous possibilities of using SharePoint 2013.